Would you like to know 5 kayak fishing tips that will catch you more fish? If so, stay tuned. Well, this week I thought I'd share with you 5 kayak fishing tips that will help you catch more fish because it's my 1-year anniversary. I started fishing about 1 year ago, so I'm a total beginner, learning as I go, and I wish somebody had shared these same tips with me when I started. Ironically, I'm doing it as I prepare tonight's dinner, which was last night's catch, a 26 3/4 inch redfish. Tip number 5. Tip number 5 has to deal with bait. Make sure that the bait you use looks exactly like the bait fish that swim around in your marsh. That's both the presentation and the look and feel of the bait. When I first started fishing, I started using all these crazy colors of bait, and sometimes those things work. Don't get me wrong, I understand what bait colors do in the water. That said, when you're first starting out, the number 1 tip is to just try to imitate the look and feel of the bait that's in the water. The same color, the same type of bait. If you do that, then you're going to catch fish, hands down. Think of it this way. When you were young, when your mother brought something new to the table and she put it in front of you, you probably, if you were young enough, didn't really look at that and say, I really want to eat it. We never want fish to feel that way. Instead, if your mother brought your favorite meal to the table and maybe it was steak and you said, oh, or hamburger and you said, great, you didn't even think about it, you just dove right in. What do you want the fish to think when they see your bait in the water? You don't want them to think about it. You want them to dive right in. So use the same natural looking baits that you find in the waters that you fish, and guaranteed, as a kayak fisherman, a beginning kayak fisherman, you'll definitely catch more fish. Tip number 4, you've got to convince yourself that it's about conditions and not locations. And I know what you're thinking. Every time you go fishing, you think, I caught fish there before, I know there's got to be fish there again. But I got to tell you, honey holes really don't exist. It's about the conditions at that location, not the location itself. And so when you discover that as kayak fishermen or women, you'll start to become more and more mobile. And you'll move around, and as you do, you'll find the fish. It's because it's about conditions and not locations. You'll find more fish by being mobile than sticking in a single spot. It's not like shoreline fishing at all. Making a little rice to go with that redfish out there. The reason we move around is because the fish themselves move around and they're not in the same place every single time. That's the reason why if you return back to the same location, it doesn't mean that you're going to catch fish that day. It all depends on the conditions themselves. So knowing the right conditions and finding those conditions in the marsh, that's a tip that is going to help you to catch more fish. For example, we have a spot in our marsh called the toilet bowl. Now, it's not called that because of the water or any of the quality of the fish that are there by any means. It's called that because that's where 5 streams come together, and when it goes from high tide to low tide, they all start to swirl just like the water in a toilet bowl. Many people believe there's always fish there, and what they're discovering is that there's not fish there all the time. And so it's not the best place to fish in our marsh, even though many fishermen believe that it is. And so on the weekends, you'll find a lot of people fishing there, and it's okay, they catch fish, but it's not the best place to fish necessarily on that day. It's not about location, it's about the conditions at the location that you fish. That's a tip that'll help you catch more fish. Tip number 3, it deals with knowing the right conditions to look for. When I first went kayak fishing, I didn't know the right conditions to look for. And in fact, it's even worse. When I first started fishing, my father would take me out to a lake at a gravel pit. And we used to slay the fish. We got up every morning at 4:30 that we would go fishing, and we'd get out there on the lake and throw from the shoreline with little bobbers. And I just used to capture all the bluegills and the bass that we wanted. The problem with taking that knowledge and bringing it to saltwater kayak fishing is that the knowledge about what fish do in a lake versus what they do out in the marsh is totally different. Inshore saltwater fishing. It's not about getting there at the crack of dawn. Now, when I show up at the marsh, there's usually a lot of people who start in the morning. I'm not knocking mornings. If that's the only time you can get out, then go do it. But it's not about the time of day. That's not one of the conditions. When it comes to inshore saltwater fishing, it's about the tide. The tide is the #1 condition that you can measure and track in order to catch more fish. Now, there are other conditions we should watch out for too, like the weather, the current, the structure. All of those things are very important, and I'm not knocking those by any means. But the tide dictates the time. So watch the tide, and here's the biggest tip for you. You can get into the science behind it, but if you start to fish 2 hours before high tide to 2 hours after high tide, you're usually going to do very, very good. It's really about the current and the water movement, but that's dictated by the tide, which is dictated by the solar and lunar schedules, and it just goes technical after that. The most important thing to do is look for the right conditions. So when I'm out on the marsh, I'm looking for movement of water. I'm going to find the most moving water in that 2 hour before and after high tide. And then as I'm looking at that condition, I'm also bringing into play the other conditions, like the fact that we're hunting predator fish, and predator fish like to ambush their prey. And so you look for places where predator fish can hide, like the points and tips of islands, or behind an oyster bed, or near a fallen tree, or some submerged pothole that is surrounded by grass. Those are the types of places where redfish, speckled trout, and flounder like to hide and surprise attack their prey. Another one is, you hear me talk a lot on my videos about pinch points. And so water current is moving, and it's going from a wide area to a narrow area through a pinch point, like the point between two islands that it squeezes in between. Well, predator fish are smart, and so they park out at those pinch points and wait for the bait fish to come through. And where can they escape to? There's almost no place, because their escape hatch is so narrow. So the predator fish wins, and they fill their belly that way. It's much like us. Think about it. If you're really hungry, do you take the time to cook a meal like what I'm cooking right now? Probably not. You'll just get in your car and go to a drive-through and order a meal, and it'll come to you. Predator fish are exactly the same way. They don't want to swim around for hours trying to find the fish. They go to where they know the bait fish will be, and then they set themselves up so that they have the advantage. So the right conditions are extremely important. It starts with knowing the tide, when it's going to be high, when the water is moving. It's all about current. It's about knowing where predator fish reside, and potholes, pinch points, and also any place they can ambush. So look for places where, if you were playing hide and seek in the marsh, that you would hide. If that's the case, a predator fish will likely be there. If the current's moving and all the other conditions come into play, there's enough water in the marsh, then you're going to catch more fish. So I wish someone had helped me with that. I would have gotten a lot more sleep than I did when I first started kayak fishing. I'll put 2 links in the description below that are tools that I use in order to tell the tide in the place where I fish. Use those tools, pick a couple hours before and after high tide, try that out, and I bet you'll catch more fish. That's my dog Gracie. Tip number 2 is really easy. Practice makes perfect. You've probably heard that phrase before, practice makes perfect. I don't really believe that. I believe practice makes consistent. And the same is true in any sport. Sports like golf, sports like kayak fishing. So if you want to catch more fish, you've got to fish more often. There's just no substitute for getting out there and consistently going fishing. So try to set some schedule. That's what I try to do. Go out once or twice a week if you can. Maybe once a month, maybe you're a weekend warrior. Whatever the case may be, the more you fish, the more you're going to get better at looking for the right conditions and putting these tips to use and catching more fish. But now, what's the #1 tip I have for you? Boy, doesn't that look good? Ah, I can't wait to eat. So without further ado, what's tip number one? Tip number one is to simply enjoy fishing. What I mean by that is sometimes in life we don't take the time to stop and smell the roses, so to speak. And so when you're out there looking at the marsh, looking at life, looking at animals and creatures, stop and enjoy it a little bit, you know? And if you don't think that'll help you catch more fish, it does for me. And I think it will for you too. The reason is because the more that you have a unique experience, the more you're going to go back. The more you're going to go back, the more fish you're going to catch because you're going to want to go practice. So that's tip number one. Stop and smell the roses. Enjoy all the scenery, all that kayak fishing, this sport, this unique sport, has to offer. I enjoy golf and I enjoy kayak fishing for the same reason. In fact, Mark Twain once said about golf that golf is a long walk ruined. Now, I don't believe in that expression. I love to play golf. He must not have been a good golfer, but the point is, it was a long walk. We don't think that golfers think about that, but I certainly do when I'm out there. And I enjoy just getting out and away from everything and everyone else, all the stresses of life, and truly enjoying it. Do that, and you're going to catch more fish. Thanks for joining me today. Click on one of these two videos over here on my left or on my right, and I'm sure you'll enjoy more catches, tips, and tricks. I'm Kayak Fishing Addict on YouTube.